ready to go to work, and that's probably because you've been waiting for an inordinate amount of time outside and probably interfered with your enthusiasm. Let me just say two things. The first one is I would never waste 2 seconds of your time. Never mind. I wouldn't waste 1 second of your time. That's the first thing I'd tell you. No way. Number two, you never know what's going to happen, and something happened completely unrelated to your role as the sole and exclusive judges of the facts of this case. Something happened that's completely unrelated to that has happened to me a grand total of 0 times in my 18 years as a judge. So we couldn't put it on the agenda as we were managing time. So this does not affect the schedule. The time that you were out doesn't affect the schedule. You'll be a deliberating jury Thursday or Friday of this week, so don't let it get in the way of your enthusiasm, your vigor, your commitment to excellence, your readiness to be the best that you can be as you listen to the evidence with seriousness, with intensity, and conscientiousness. Did any of the jurors have any difficulty following the instructions of the court not to discuss the case among yourselves or with anybody else? Any of the jurors have any difficulty following the instructions of the court avoiding information from any source other than one in the courtroom during this recess? None of the jurors have answered affirmatively. Ms. McDougall, please.
Dr. Hebben, in addition to the MMPIA, did you conduct a test, the acronym for which is the BASC-2?
I did.
And what does the BASC-2 stand for?
The BASC-2, it stands for the Behavior Assessment System for Children. It's the 2nd edition. That's what the 2 stands for. I gave the self-report of personality measure appropriate for Mr. Chism's age.
And what is the BASC-2 intended to test or to measure?
It is another inventory that's designed to help objectify self-report of symptoms and to see if various aspects of a person's functioning, if areas are compromised, what areas are compromised, according to this individual self-report.
And how is the BASC-2 administered? Is it also true, false, multiple choice? How does it work?
I believe it actually it allows you to answer questions according to a scale from not at all to a little, somewhat, and often. Although I believe there are also some questions that are true, or statements that are true, false.
What were the results of the BASC-2 as administered to Philip Chism?
Well, like the MMPI, the BASC-2 has also validity scales, so you can look at whether or not someone is answering consistently or perhaps just responding randomly, which again would invalidate the results that you get. And you can look at whether or not someone is exaggerating or faking bad, as it's called. And the results from Mr. Chism's were indeed that he was showing what was thought to be excessive negativity and a fake bad profile.
Malingering.
I don't think that from the BASC you can say necessarily that it's malingering. It's consistent with malingering. Faking bad is someone who is certainly exaggerating their problems.
Now, in addition to those 2, once having completed those 2 instruments and having gotten the results that you got, what analysis did you do to determine whether you do other testing?
Well, based on, actually at that point in time, these are scored after the fact, and they're scored by the computer. It's a standard interpretation that's done, interpretive reports. I included the symptom validity measure, 2 symptom validity measures, the structured inventory of reported symptoms, which is exactly what it says it is. It's an inventory that it's structured in the way you ask the questions, the particular questions that are asked, and then and it is specifically designed to look at whether or not someone is feigning mental illness. And I also administered the Miller forensic assessment of symptoms, I think it is, the MFAST. which is a similar thing. It's more of a screening measure than the Sears is. Sears is a very in-depth one that you actually do as an interview, a structured interview. The MFAST, a person has the questions in front of them and indicates their answers on a sheet.
And with respect to the Sears and the MFAST, did you do any, did you take into consideration the defendant's age at the time you were testing him before deciding to perform those two particular tests?
I did.
Starting with the Sears, can you explain to the jury what considerations you needed to take into account in giving the Sears to an individual, the defendant's age at the time you were testing him in September?
When the Sears was designed, it was designed for individuals 18 years and up. And so technically, Mr. Chism didn't fall into that group. So I consulted with Richard Rodgers' textbook on assessing deception, in specific the chapter assessing deception in children and adolescents, and made sure that there were in fact norms, but that the test had been validated downward to age 14, so that I could feel confident in using it in collaboration with other instruments to look for converging validity.
I'm just going to stop you for 1 second. What is the significance of Richard Rodgers' textbook with respect to the Sears test in particular?
Well, he actually developed the Sears. He did not write that chapter. It's an edited book, but Richard Rodgers is the author of the Sears.
And when you just use the term convergent validity, can you explain to the jury what you mean by that term and what you're looking for?
What I'm looking for is, are all the test results coming in the same direction? What I want to do is to reduce the risk of obtaining a false positive. I don't want one marker or one test that says someone is feigning mental illness and then go from there and say, oh, well, I know that this person is feigning mental illness. I want multiple measures that point in the same direction before I'm willing to make to draw such a conclusion.
And in fact, did you give the defendant the Sears after establishing that it had been validated down to 14?
Yes.
And what were the results of the Sears for the defendant, Philip Chism?
On the Sears, I just need to refresh my memory. He had one, the Sears is arranged so that you can look at definite malingering versus probable malingering versus indeterminate, you just can't know, versus normal or honest responding. And I believe he had only one score in the honest range out of multiple scores. Most scores were in the indeterminate range, and one score was 1 point away from definite malingering.
And so now you've done 3 instruments, is that correct at this point?
Correct.
Did you, I think you referred to the MFAST, did you at that point consider the MFAST for Mr. Chism?
I had considered I had brought along the MFAST with my test materials.
And once again, with respect to the MFAST, did you have any concerns with administering the MFAST to someone of the defendant's age in September of 2015?
Well, at the MFAST, like many of our tests for both performance validity and symptom validity, with the exception of when you have a test that has embedded validity measures like the MMPI and the VASC. Most of these standalone measures of performance validity and symptom validity have been initially validated in adult populations. And so what I want, and that was true of the MFAST 18 and above. And so I did some research to find how close could I get to an individual who was 16 years, 6 months old, and indeed found that there was evidence that it had been used in individuals as young as 17.
And at that point, did you make a determination to use the MFAST with the defendant?
I did, yes.
And how does the MFAST work?
The MFAST is simply a series of statements, questions that, like the Sears, are things that are rarely seen in true psychopathology, or are combinations of things that are rarely seen. And so a person either says, yes, that affects me, or no, it does not. And then ultimately that's all put together. You never take anything from one question alone. It's the questions taken all together from which an interpretation of a test is drawn.
And what were your conclusions with respect to Mr. Chism and the MFAS test?
On the MFAST, he achieved a score that had a positive predictive accuracy of 100% for feigning mental illness. I believe the score for a clinical population, that is individuals who have true mental illness, documented mental illness, would be unlikely to get a score, I believe the cutoff is 10, and his score was 16.
Now, in addition to the 4 tests you've already described for us, did you do any other testing of Mr. Chism that informed your ultimate conclusions that you provided to Dr. Kincher?
I did additional testing, but because of the evidence of likely exaggeration or outright feigning of mental illness, I couldn't rely on those results because they were things like measurement of depression, anxiety, and so on. And I did not know how much of his self-report was accurate. So I gave what's called the Beck Youth Inventories, which looks at anxiety, depression, self-esteem, anger, and disruptive behavior. And
I'm sorry, what was the last thing?
Disruptive behavior. And he had significant elevation on the anger scale, a lesser but also extreme elevation on the disruptive behavior scale, and a milder elevation on the depression scale.
Doctor, let me ask you this. With respect to all of the testing you did, would you administer those tests to someone that you had concluded was experiencing psychosis?
If someone were floridly psychotic, I wouldn't test them at all because I wouldn't know if I was getting their true performance when they're in a state of mind where they're more connected with reality.
And based on the time you spent with Mr. Chism and based on your observations, did you reach a conclusion as to whether he was floridly psychotic in September of 2015?
I did.
What was that opinion?
Based on my observations and other information that I gathered, I did not believe that he was actively psychotic at the time that I was assessing him.
And Dr. Hebben, based on all of the testing that you personally did and your results, did you reach an opinion to a reasonable degree of psychological certainty as to the results of your testing? Let me ask you this, did you reach an opinion to a reasonable degree of psychological certainty to convergent validity?
I did.
And what was that opinion?
My opinion was that his report across these various measures revealed multiple inconsistencies, and that taken together with his history and his presentation to me were highly suggestive of a malingered mental illness.
And Doctor, you certainly, even in a finding of malingered mental illness, cannot rule out that there's also mental illness at play, can you?
That's true. Malingering really can sort of come at 3 levels. You can have what's called pure malingering, and that is a person who is outright faking a mental illness. You can have partial malingering in that a person does have mental illness and they're simply exaggerating the symptoms. And you can have a sort of misattribution malingering, that is a person has symptoms of mental illness and is consciously attributing them to what they know to be a false source of the problem.
Now, Doctor, after you had reached your conclusions independently based on your own testing, did you have an opportunity to review testing that had been done prior to your involvement, or the raw data for that testing?
I did.
And were there any particular testing that was significant to you in either undermining or corroborating your own conclusions?
Yes.
What was that?
The testing that was most important in terms of the issue of malingering was the intellectual testing that had been done first in March of 2014, and then a second attempt to measure intellect in June of 2015.
And can you just explain to the jury, based on your training, are these intellectual tests that you typically would use in your practice with individuals other than Mr. Chism?
Well, I actually would have done intellectual testing of Mr. Chism, but my review of all the school records and so on indicated that there was absolutely no reason to suspect that he had a cognitive defect that could have impacted his behavior in this circumstance. So I was aware that he had been given an intellectual...
Maybe heard it side by.
It depends on where your the objection is starting.
Right now,
None from this point on?
yes.
Okay, the objection is sustained.
Did you have an opportunity to review the raw data from the intellectual testing done in March of 2014 and June of 2015?
I did.
And was your interpretation of that raw data significant to you?
It was.
What was significant about it?
Objection.
Okay. I will see counsel at the sidebar, please. So a few times during the trial, I've given you a limiting instruction. Limiting instructions really do require you to compartmentalize your mind and be disciplined and consider the evidence only for the purpose for which it's being admitted and for no other purpose. And so as it relates to the direct testimony that you're hearing, this evidence may be considered by you as it relates to issues and contentions of allegedly faking bad, exaggerating problems, or malingering or convergent validity, and it may not be considered for any other reason.
Dr. Hebben, without going into the details of the testing, prior testing you reviewed, did anything in the prior testing you reviewed undermine your conclusions that you've already testified to?
Nothing at all.
And in fact, why, is there something called a practice effect?
Yes, there is.
So before I ask the next question, can you explain what a practice effect is?
Well, in testing, having taken a test can prepare you and prep you for taking that test in the future. So we have to be concerned with any testing that has already taken place and take that into consideration in developing test batteries that we're going to use in someone who's already been tested and in what particular tests we're going to do. And if we do repeat a test, taking into consideration practice effects in our interpretation of the results.
So going into your testing, did you know what testing had already been done but not the raw data or results of that testing?
That's correct.
And it was only after you had completed your testing and reached your own conclusions that you had an opportunity to review the raw data?
It was only after I'd completed my testing. I had the raw data before I wrote my report. However, I did not use that raw data in the development of my opinion. My opinion is based solely on the data that I personally collected.
I have nothing further for Dr. Hebben at this time.
Okay, Ms. Regan, are you able to inquire in other areas?
Yep.
Okay, when you've exhausted that, if you could let me know so I can see you at the sidebar, please?
Yes.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Dr. Hebben.
Good afternoon.
Now, you met with Philip Chism once, correct?
Correct.
And you met with him on August 17th, 2015, correct?
That sounds correct, yes.
And you met with him from 11:30 to 2:30, correct?
That sounds right, yes.
And during that time, there was no break, correct?
That's correct, no break.
Now, and you gave him tests that had a lot of questions, correct?
Yes, there are some of the questions. The MMPI, for example, has quite a few questions.
So the MMPI has 470 questions, is that right?
I can, I don't have no way of checking, but that maybe I do. Wait a second, hold on.
I think that you have the answer sheet.
Yes, that's exactly what I was thinking. I might have the answer sheet. 470.
And the SRP, part of the BASC, has 137?
Is that it? I thought it was a few more than that. I thought it was like
Can you check how many?
thought maybe it was 170 something. I have 176.
Okay. And the Sears has about 156?
That sounds about right, yeah.
And the MFAS has 25?
Correct.
So it was about 900 questions all totaled?
I didn't do the math just now, but if
Quite a few.
you would stipulate to that, yeah.
Now, you found that Philip Chism was malingering, correct?
My opinion is that the test data indicate that there's a very likely possibility, or it's very likely that Philip Chism was malingering mental illness.
And what you mean is exaggerating his symptoms, correct?
Well, I can't know if it's simply exaggeration or if it's an outright, it's that more pure malingering that I talked about.
So Philip Chism, there are a couple possibilities then. Philip Chism could have no psychiatric symptoms at all and just be exaggerating all his symptoms, correct?
Well, he could be creating
Creating
symptoms
all
in
his
that
sy-
circumstance, yes.
So Philip Chism could have no mental health symptoms at all, and he could be creating out of whole cloth his symptoms.
Yes, that would be pure malingering.
Or Philip Chism could have mental health symptoms and be exaggerating those symptoms, correct?
That's correct. That's partial malingering.
Or Philip Chism could have mental health symptoms and not endorse those symptoms on the test, but endorse others that he doesn't have, correct?
I'm not sure how to answer that question. How would I have any way of knowing if he's choosing to, the questions aren't separate, so that, yes, certain items fall into certain categories and go different ways, but there's a lot of overlap in those. So that if he's reporting symptoms, he's likely reporting, if this is partial malingering, he's likely reporting both symptoms he does have as well as symptoms he does not, or which he is exaggerating.
And he also may be claiming symptoms, that he has symptoms currently that he doesn't have currently, correct?
If you mean by that, could this be pure malingering? I think I already answered that, yes, it could be pure malingering.
But the problem with malingering, or finding malingering, is that you don't know what's behind it, correct?
What is behind what?
I could have a moment.
Sure.
The presence of malingering does not rule out the possibility that Philip Chism has a mental illness, correct?
Correct, that's the partial malingering that I was talking about. I can't know from his report whether it was pure malingering or partial malingering.
And the results from his evaluation, what they just tell you is his self-report via your test was unreliable.
No, they don't show that it's unreliable. In fact, the convergence across the 4 tests indicate that it was indeed very reliable. What it tells us is that we can't know accurately if he does have a mental illness and what that mental illness is.
But didn't you write in your report, the results from this evaluation indicate his self-report is unreliable?
Could you direct me to where it is so I can be sure?
Page 19, second to last paragraph, last sentence.
Okay, so the test results are not unreliable, but we can't trust that Mr. Chism is reliably reporting.
Mr. Chism's answers aren't reliable, right?
No. Mr. Chism's approach is inconsistent enough with his reported behavior is inconsistent enough with his observed behavior, and his reported behavior is inconsistent enough, and that's the meaning of reliability, inconsistent, is inconsistent enough with the test findings that we cannot take the test findings as a valid representation of whether or not there is a mental illness underlying this.
I'm going to read you a sentence, and you tell me if you agree with it. The presence of malingering does not rule out the possibility Philip Chism is experiencing some kind of psychopathology, but the results from this evaluation indicate his self-report is unreliable and makes accurate diagnosis difficult.
That's
Correct?
exactly what I was just explaining, which is his self-report is inconsistent with his observed behavior. His self-report is inconsistent with the test results, meaning that his self-report is unreliable, and therefore we cannot take his self-report as valid representations or valid indications of whether or not he has a mental illness or he has a mental illness and he's simply exaggerating it.
Now, I'm going to just read that sentence again.
Objection.
Well, I'm going to allow it because I think that, that the answer goes beyond the question and therefore may be lost for the purpose for which it's being offered.
If I could just ask them that the entire sentence, which was just read, but was not read the first two times, be read.
Under the doctrine of completeness, if that doesn't happen, the doctrine of completeness under 106 is a rule of interruption. If Ms. Regan doesn't do it, you can stand up and do it immediately.
Right. True or false? I'm reading a sentence you wrote in your report. The presence of malingering does not rule out the possibility Philip is experiencing some type of psychopathology, but the results from this evaluation indicate his self-report is unreliable and makes accurate diagnosis difficult. True?
Yes, that is what I wrote in my report. Philip Chism's report did not reliably convey whether or not he has a mental illness or is exaggerating a mental illness.
So, have you been trained not to answer a question yes or no on cross-examination?
Objection.
If the answer goes beyond the question and you have a motion to strike, I'll certainly consider it, Ms. Regan.
What was the referral question from Dr. Kinshirf?
Dr. Kinshirf asked that I do whatever evaluation was appropriate for aiding him in his putting together all of the history, all of the records, all of the data, with all of the test results, with his interviews, to come to a diagnosis for Mr. Chism if he was able to do so. So my task was to do whatever tests would be necessary to answer questions about diagnosis for Mr. Chism.
So, you picked the tests,
That's correct.
and you gave 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 tests, correct?
Yes,
Now, one was a test of memory malingering, correct?
correct.
And he was not shown to be he was not shown to be, he was shown to be reliable on that test, correct?
On that particular test, he scored normally.
And on the dot counting test, he scored normal.
Correct.
No sign of malingering there. On those particular tests, just limiting you to these tests,
I understand, but I was going to try to answer the question. The dot counting test and the test of memory malingering, despite its name, is not a direct test of malingering. It's not a symptom validity test, it's a performance validity test. And what it looks at is whether or not someone scores normally, and then you can assume that any cognitive tests that you've given are representative of a person's cognitive ability. A positive score, for example, in the direction of poor effort, for example, on the dot counting test, would lead you to the conclusion that, I need to investigate this more, and the person is giving poor effort, but it doesn't necessarily lead you to a conclusion that someone is malingering, not in the way that the symptom validity tests like the Sears and the MFAS do.
but it's a test of a certain kind of faking, correct?
It's really considered a test of effort. One of the things that can happen in neuropsychological testing is that we're dependent on the person to be doing their best. but not everybody does their best. And we can't see suboptimal effort unless a person just absolutely refuses to be tested. Well, we can't see if someone's not doing their best. So we have tests like the dot counting test that allow us to evaluate whether or not someone is working effortfully in the test, and therefore allow us some confidence that the results we're obtaining are accurate and reliable representations of their cognitive ability. The dot counting test is not a symptom validity test. It's a performance validity test. It's looking at another issue.
So Philip was trying on these tests.
Philip was, the other thing about performance validity tests is you can take something from a negative result, but you can't be certain with a positive result. In other words, if someone shows evidence of poor effort or fails a performance validity test, then you can go forward and say, I can't be confident that these tests represent, that on the neuropsychological tests, that they represent anything more than the minimum of someone is capable of. If someone scores normally on performance validity tests, you can't, it doesn't go in that direction. I mean, you're going to go forward and interpret the test results, but all you can say is that it appeared that they were giving full effort on those particular tests.
So he doesn't win with those.
Well, I didn't give him cognitive measures. So, I mean, he wins in the sense that he scored normally on the dot counting test and the TOM, but those, again, are performance validity tests, and they're about cognitive ability. They're not symptom validity tests about psychopathology.
But again, if he had scored abnormal on those, it would be a sign that he wasn't trying, correct?
That's correct. If he had scored abnormally on those, it would be an indication that were I to have given him cognitive ability tests or cognitive tests, that I couldn't be certain I was capturing his full potential.
And if he had scored abnormal on those, that could show a different type of him skewing tests, correct?
That's correct. They could. You can't, if from a failure on a performance validity test, you can't immediately jump to the issue of malingering, but there are some performances on those kinds of tests that would lead you to the conclusion that someone were malingering. For example, if someone on a test were to score below chance, that cannot happen by chance alone. And so if someone scores below chance on one of these measures, then you know that at least on some of the items, they purposely chose the wrong response, and that in and of itself is malingering. So you can go to the issue of malingering, but they're not tests of malingering in the same way that the Sears and the MFAS are tests of malingering.
Anything else you want to say?
Objection.
Again, as far as the issue that you're addressing with that last question, Ms. Regan, if there's a motion to strike, for instance, from the plaintiff, for example, I would entertain it. If you want to repeat the question, if you get a non-responsive answer, you can do that. Sure.
The MFAST is a test for malingering, correct?
Correct.
The Sears Structured Inventory of Reported Symptoms is a test for malingering, correct?
Correct.
The MMPIA has a portion that looks at malingering, correct?
Yes.
So, and then you gave two other tests. The self-report of personality, correct?
The BAST, too, yes.
And the Beck Youth Inventory, too, correct?
Correct.
So, you gave, we'd already established you gave 7 tests, right?
Correct.
And 5 of them looked, at least in some part, at malingering, correct?
5 of them could be used in the direction of assessing for malingering, although they're not all direct measures of malingering.
Is the MFAST a direct measure of malingering?
Yes.
Is the Sears a direct measure of malingering?
Yes.
Is the test of memory malingering a direct test of the issue of effort?
Yes.
Is the dot counting test a direct test of the issue of effort?
Yes.
Now, a manual for a test is an important tool, correct?
Yes.
And a manual ensures that the test is given consistently so that scoring can be as accurately as accurate as possible?
Manuals are developed so that it instructs the person who's using the test how to score, how to administer score and interpret the test.
Manuals ensure that a test is given consistently so that scoring is as accurate as possible, correct?
Well, I'm struggling with the word ensures because the manual itself can't ensure. The manual sets forward those things with the idea that a psychologist or whoever using the test will then give the test in the proper way.
One of the purposes of a manual is to ensure the test is given consistently so scoring is as accurate as possible.
Again, I have trouble with how a manual can ensure anything, but the point of a manual is to set out all the parameters for a standard test, a standardized test, and how to give it so that it is given properly.
And you advise even experienced testers reread the manual from time to time before giving a test.
Yes, I think that sometimes if you don't use something a lot, or as you, or if or over time you find you're sort of deviating, it's helpful to go back and review the manual.
And scoring must be done according to the manual, correct?
Scoring must be done, if you wish to use it for the purposes it was designed, then scoring must be done according to the manual.
An important issue is whether a test has validity and reliability for the particular application for which it's considered, correct?
Correct.
Now, for every test you select, it's important to have good normative data appropriate against which to compare a patient's performance.
Yes.
So a certain test that only has data supporting its use with adults wouldn't be appropriate for a 12-year-old, correct?
I can't say that universally is true, but I would be very cautious using tests developed for an adult with a 12-year-old, yes.
Actually, it's almost 1 o'clock. Let me talk to council about scheduling if I could, please. Gentlemen, I talked to the lawyers so that I could get a sense of timing. And the timing I'm hearing from the lawyers, that the evidence will either end tomorrow or Thursday morning. You should be prepared tomorrow, although I really don't think it's going to happen, to stay past 1 o'clock tomorrow. I don't think that's going to happen, but just be prepared in case. And the estimate is that the evidence will end tomorrow or Thursday morning. Don't discuss the case among yourselves or with anybody else. Don't do any independent investigation concerning the case. Avoid any information from any source other than in the courtroom. Juries are excused until 9 o'clock tomorrow morning.
All rise. Hear ye, hear ye, hear ye. All persons having anything further to do before the Honorable David Lowy, Justice of the Superior Court, now sitting at Salem, within and for this county of Essex at present, depart and give your attendance at this place Wednesday morning next at 9 a.m., to which time and place the sitting of this court is now adjourned.